and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see so many participants joining us to tackle a giant of a topic. My name is Arnes Biogradlija, and I'll be your moderator. I'm here to ensure our discussion is enlightening and energizing as a double espresso on a Monday morning. In the realm of energy, hydrogen has been like a mythical giant, promising a colossal impact on our clean energy future. But as in any good story, every Goliath has mysteries and myths to uncover. Today, we're here to challenge the giant, to see if the promise of hydrogen is as big as the hype, or if we're just shadow boxing with windmills. To face this Goliath, we couldn't have asked for a better David than Professor David Hart. Yes, you heard it right. David versus Goliath. But in this case, our David comes armed with over 30 years of expertise and a slingshot full of data and insights. Professor Hart has been on the front line, dissecting every aspect of hydrogen technology from potential highs to possible lows. His work has illuminated paths for industry stalwarts and nations crafting their energy policies. David, welcome.
Thank you, Arnes, and welcome to all of you. It's fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to have a dialogue with you. And what I'm going to do is present, and then we can have some discussion about what's really happening and what your concerns and interests are to do with the hydrogen economy and its development. So, background, as Arnes kindly said, I'm a visiting professor at Imperial College, hence the title. I'm also the Global Partner Lead for Hydrogen at ERM. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And I'm also on the International Advisory Board for the World Hydrogen Energy Conference and for the International Association of Hydrogen Energy. And I thoroughly endorse the videos at the beginning saying that Cancun is a great place to be for the next World Hydrogen Energy Conference coming up in June. And we'll touch on that again later.
Thank you, David.
So what I really wanted to talk about is whether we are already seeing a slowdown in the hydrogen transition. And that's because there's a lot of news out there at the moment saying, oh no, things are going terribly wrong. We are never going to have hydrogen. It's not the answer. What are we going to do? And I think we need to unpick some of this, as Arnes said, by looking at some of the facts and looking at some previous energy transitions to understand where we're going.
So, Professor Hart will lead us through a battleground, covering reality checks on the industry progress, unveiling the trends beneath the eye-catching headlines, and strategizing for the economic and policy arenas that hydrogen must conquer. And remember, this is not a monologue, it's a dialogue. Throw your questions into the arena. We'll have a Q&A session where Professor Hart will tackle them head-on, helping demystify the giant, which is hydrogen. We'll start after the short break. So, without any further ado, let's arm ourselves with knowledge and curiosity and dive into the topic. Professor Hart, the floor is yours to bring down the Goliath.
Thank you, Arnes. And what a wonderful video! What a wonderful place to have a conference. Cancun in June. It looks lovely. So, to lead us up to that, I want to talk about a few things. First, I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from, so ERM and our perspective on hydrogen and my 30 years in the business. And then a little bit about, what's going on? Why are we seeing the headlines we're seeing? How does that fit into an energy transition, which is what we're really trying to do? And why hydrogen anyway? Why do we care? What is the importance? I'm going to talk then about progress that's really being made, and maybe finish on some discomfort, because any transition involves shocks and it involves uncertainties and it involves dislocations. So I'm going to talk about that as well. But let me start with ERM. So ERM is the world's largest sustainability consultancy, 8,000 people across the world. And the focus is very much on sustainability across all areas, but particularly these days around decarbonisation and everything linked to improving quality of life and improving energy systems. So climate change is a big focus for us. And the reason we are involved and the reason we look at hydrogen is because it fits into a decarbonisation framework. And so here we just see the way that we would approach a problem. And this is important because this informs some of my discussions later on. It informs the energy systems thinking, and it informs the way that we problem solve. So it's about setting the right framing for an opportunity, the ambitions and the goals, and then figuring out exactly how you take the detailed steps to get to the end point. And then, of course, it's about making sure that you stay there, that you improve, that you are certified, etc. And we have technology capabilities across all of the things that you see at the bottom. I've highlighted hydrogen because that's my home, that's my love, as it were. But I have conversations with all of the people in the other sectors who say, well, really, hydrogen? What about batteries? What about renewables? Why don't we use biofuels? So we keep each other honest by having these discussions about competing options. And that's really important because hydrogen is not a god. We've talked about hydrogen as Goliath, perhaps, but we want it to be something that's real and useful and that has a value. And we want to be challenging ourselves as to where that can possibly take place. So the final bit to talk about, just as the scene setting, is what we do, but also what is important in order to make hydrogen projects work and in order to embed them into the energy system. And that's about setting the right policy directions, about understanding the regulatory frameworks, about the support mechanisms. It's about making sure that people are doing projects properly, the technology works, there is safety, that everything is planned and integrated together. It's about the technologies themselves, what's already in existence, what's coming down the pipeline, where the potential for change comes in the future, and where you need to take a bet, to take a risk perhaps on one technology which is stable versus maybe a better one in the future. So there are many, many things that integrate into our capabilities, but also into the hydrogen value chain. And with that background, I want to take a look of the hydrogen world as we see it from the headlines. And I think that's really important because the headlines give us a snapshot into people's thinking and people's reactions. So what is going on? Why did I title this, Are We Slowing Down Before We've Speeded Up? And it's true, things are not settled in the hydrogen world. This is just a few headlines that I've taken from H2 View, where I also sit on the editorial board. So that's why I like to choose them. But it's also a good summary just from the last few weeks of challenges that we see in the development of the hydrogen economy. So what about offtake uncertainty? We see projects which are slowing down, which are stalling, which can't get guaranteed offtake, either because pricing is uncertain or because policy support is uncertain, or because the supply chain is not evolved enough to be able to guarantee delivery from production to where it's needed. What about hydrogen in heating? That's a big and controversial topic. Does that actually help? Should we just use heat pumps? What about the storage in the system? What about the other impacts of hydrogen? I'll touch those later on. And we've seen a lot recently, or at least I have, about electrolyzers. Are we building too many electrolyzers? Do we have too much capacity? If we're pushing out the projects that need electrolyzers, do we worry about the fact that there will be factories which are unused or underused? What about the trade-off between Europe, North America, and China? Is somebody going to win? So there are all sorts of uncertainties, all sorts of difficulties, and all sorts of questions which are emerging based on people starting to put real projects into action. And we see that as very, very important. We can only learn how to move fast and safely by actually trying. So we need a balance, and I'll come back to this at the end, between the things that work and we understand and are not very ambitious, and the things we need to do in order to make a difference to climate change and to growing the hydrogen economy. So the flip side of the headlines are that there is an enormous amount happening. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's very much about developments in different areas. And I've picked these titles deliberately because they cover everything from fuel cells to electrolyzers to hydrogen emissions to airships. And that's important because hydrogen is a part of the energy system. It's a part of the glue that potentially holds the energy system together. It's not the only solution. It's part of a set of solutions that enables us to meet our future climate challenges and develop economic growth and develop improved quality of life and improve diversity and equity and inclusion and all sorts of other things which you may not think of immediately, but which actually are going to be very important. So this gives an indication of the sort of range that we're covering. Hydrogen-powered ferries, fuel cell factories being built in the USA because of very strong policy backing and money from the IRA. What about natural hydrogen? Some of you may have seen this. It's also called gold hydrogen or white hydrogen or geological hydrogen. But it's the potential that we can actually drill for hydrogen as we've drilled for fossil fuels in the past. And that's something that might be a game changer, might enable us to get very low cost hydrogen, but it's very early in the development pathway. And so we need to explore these things. And there's one headline up here, which is a pro and con headline. And I've put it here because I think it's good news, because I think it's really important that we push forward the scientific understanding of what hydrogen does. 20 years ago, when I was lecturing at Imperial College, I would say, firstly, you can't mine for hydrogen. So I was proved wrong there. And secondly, hydrogen escapes through the atmosphere because it is a very light molecule and it reaches escape velocity. And that's sort of true, but not really. We have a background emission of hydrogen, and we have hydrogen which reacts in the atmosphere and has some implications for global warming. It's a very complicated scientific area. At the moment, there is a negligible contribution, but we need to understand what's going on. And that's why this scientific aspect is a good thing. We need to figure out what we're doing. But that's the big headlines. That's the clickbait. That's the stuff that catches your eyes. And what we really need to do is set that into context. And I've chosen this context, the energy transition, because that is fundamentally what we're doing. And the reason that I put this on the slide, the World Energy Outlook of 2023, and the comment from Fatih Birol, who is the head of the IEA, he has said, we are in an energy transition. It is happening. It is important. The IEA comes from an oil and gas background. So it's very interesting that they are so committed to understanding what we do next and where we go next, and the importance of hydrogen within that. This is a very old slide. It's one I've been using for years and years, but I use it to illustrate the fact that this concept of energy transition and the concept of a hydrogen economy are not new. So this is an interesting way of looking at the world, which is actually about the proportion of hydrogen to carbon in the total energy mix. So we started off with coal in the Industrial Revolution, the north of the UK. We developed the steam engine. Arguably, that's where we started causing all our problems. But of course, at the same time, we improved people's lives. We enabled all sorts of new technologies. But there was a lot of carbon in coal versus the hydrogen. And there's a lot of energy in hydrogen versus carbon. We moved to oil and the combustion engine, and then we moved to natural gas, the gas turbine. But those energy transitions were driven by new technology innovation, by discovering and manipulating different fuels. Initially, gas was just seen as a waste product that actually was potentially a danger until we managed to harness it and use it as a clean burning fuel. And it was driven by profit and economic growth. But we've always combusted hydrogen in some form or another, at least as it's linked into other hydrocarbons. The next slide shows where we are now, which is we are pushing an energy transition, not because of its utility and because of its economic benefits, though it can have both of those. It's driven by policy and it's driven by a problem that we have caused, which is carbon in the atmosphere. But if we look at the other headlines that I haven't shown, they are about flooding. They are about heat waves. They're about people dying prematurely. They're about major natural disasters, about coral reefs bleaching. There is an enormous cost, both numerically and economically, as well as intrinsically, to the climate crisis. And so nobody wins if we carry on with business as usual. The difficulty with this transition is that we need to invest now, we need to disrupt now in order to get a benefit sometime in the future. And it may not be the same people who invest who get the benefit. And there is no system architect. There is nobody saying, this is the perfect system. You must put this project here and this project here and connect these things two together, and that will be the right answer. It's competitive. It's anarchic. Applications overlap. Geopolitics enter into the fray. And there are lots of non-traditional entrants who are trying to figure out their place in the world. The chart at the top, though, shows a change, again from the IEA World Energy Outlook, in where we are investing. I'm sure this has changed slightly in the last year because of the Ukraine crisis, because of a switch maybe back to lower gas prices in certain places from the very high spikes that we saw at the beginning of the crisis. But still, most investment now is going into low emissions energy. And that's really important because that is partly hydrogen. And we need to carry that with us as the framework for the next few slides. So why hydrogen? And I'm sure many of you on the call already know or already think about hydrogen as part of an energy system, but it's worth reminding ourselves because it potentially has bigger benefits or bigger implications than we had initially imagined. So I've tried to pull these mostly together in this single slide, and it's really about the system. So everything is a system. We start, at least I start, by thinking about the energy system. How do we deliver a service that we value and that enriches our lives in the optimal way, which includes the economics, the affordability, the accessibility, and also the implications for climate and environment more generally. But those are big picture benefits. There's a biodiversity system which sits around the energy system. There's a climate system. There's a water system. But hydrogen brings benefits initially to the energy system and then potentially into other areas. And this sounds grandiose, I know, but we're working on a project at the moment with the Hydrogen Council, which looks at how the hydrogen economy overlaps with the Sustainable Development Goals and how you can support both with each other. And that's a really interesting area because there are things you can do with hydrogen that you probably didn't expect. The complicated charts on here really are supposed to illustrate the amount of analysis that has gone into this. So I said there was no system architect. There are people who do extremely detailed minute-by-minute modeling of energy flows in energy systems, existing and potential future networks, to try and understand what the implications are of introducing a new energy carrier and what that means for storage and for emissions and for time of day pricing and for infrastructure and for investment. And so this is an illustration that often we think about hydrogen as being a cost for a single solution. So people will say, well, actually, if all you want to do is decarbonize heating, then it's better to electrify and go to heat pumps. And in some cases, that will absolutely be true. But if you are also thinking about network storage effects and grid balancing and long-term effects of not just diurnal storage, but annual storage, and if you're thinking about equipment and grid upsizing and all sorts of other things, it starts to become a much more complicated picture. And it turns out that in some cases, hydrogen is actually potentially quite a good idea for heating. Not everywhere, not all the time, and we need to make our choices and decide how to implement it. And all of the other implications shown in the bottom corner, which is what about fuels and chemicals production? What about the interaction between different parts of the system? What about hydrogen for transport? Again, electrification will go a long way, but it may not be able to help us in some of the most heavy-duty applications, some of the trains, some of the ships, some of the aircraft, and even some of the long-distance trucking. So the system benefit is the benefit of hydrogen. It's also the complication. It's really hard to value this for an actor who only looks at one part of the system. Are we making progress? Because this is about whether we're speeding up or slowing down. And we need to understand the context because we need to understand the difficulty. But progress is a marker along that line. And here I find these slides useful to use. There are many other slides out there which track the number of projects which have been announced, the number which are in build and pre-feasibility and all sorts of other things. But these are two slides taken from data by the Hydrogen Council and McKinsey, which look at what happened a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So in May 2022, there were about 50 gigascale projects announced, 240 billion worth of US dollars in the hydrogen pipeline. And then you start working through the pipeline. Some of those are projects that will never happen. They're just announced, they're hopeful, they don't have the financial backing. Some are moving to pre-feasibility and feed studies, and then about 10% at that time, 22 billions worth, were in final investment decision. So those are actually projects that are going to go forward. Those are projects where people have found off-takers and put money in and are building. And the 51 moved rapidly in a year and a half to 166 gigascale projects. 1,400 projects in total a year ago. I don't have the data yet for this year, but I'm sure it will have gone up again, though we will probably see a stretching in terms of the time taken from a project to be initially announced and the time taken for it to get to final investment decision. But that's not an abnormal thing. So we see here, we still have at least 10% of projects across the board in final investment decision. And many of those are really being built and moving forward quite rapidly. But we also see projects falling by the wayside. And that's normal, as I said, but it also reflects changes in the economic situation, in interest rates, uncertainty in policy. It reflects supply chain questions. It reflects the geopolitics around critical materials and the possibility of alternatives being developed in different places. But there is real progress. We have moved fast and we started from a very low base. And I want to put that in context as well. So the numbers on the previous slide look great. There's a lot happening. We see project announcements, we see scaling up. But let's put that into some sort of framework. So the diagram on the left is from the US Department of Energy. It's hydrogen at scale, they call it. It's where hydrogen fits in as the system glue, as I referred to earlier, to join together all of these different parts of the energy system. And you can see in the middle, there's an electrolyzer. There's hydrogen coming from electricity and being produced to use in all sorts of different ways. And that means we're going to need a lot of electrolyzers. And the chart, again, from the IEA on the top, shows where we were, the old reality. The electrolyzer industry used to be 200 or 300 megawatts a year. You can barely see the dot on the chart. And we are trying to scale that. We're trying to scale a whole industry with multiple different technologies, multiple different suppliers, a whole range of different materials and supply chains. by orders of magnitude in an extremely short time. This is an extremely challenging task. And even those orders of magnitude, which you see in the big red blocks at the top, do not yet meet what is the IEA's net zero scenario shown in the bottom. So the bottom is how many electrolyzers we would need, according to the IEA model, to move towards net zero in the energy system by 2030. So we've had an enormous amount of electrolyzer capacity announced. That's factories that should be able to produce electrolyzers. A lot of that's in China, but not all of it. Not all of that is operational, and even the factories that are built are not all running 24/7. So there is slack in there, and there is certainly a difference between what has been announced and what we see really coming out of the factory gate. And even that is not enough to meet the sort of ambitious targets that either the IEA model predicts or we see from different governments and different regions of the world saying, this is how many gigawatts of electrolysis we want to put in. So let's put this back into context. We need to move very fast. We're starting from a very low base, and we don't have all of the industrial capability in place to allow us to just turn on the tap. And that's something that's important when we think about whether we're really speeding up or slowing down. Final bit of energy transition context. I want to compare and contrast. So data from IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, this looks at solar and wind from their database and how that has scaled over the past 15 years and where it has scaled. So you can see there's a constant growth, a very significant growth, and the curve is looking very positive. About half of that was put into Asia last year. Most of that is China. So there's a really significant contribution from China into this renewable energy transition. But even that is not big enough. We have commitments from COP28 last year that says we need to triple renewables by 2030. And that's, again, a really significant step up. And that involves all sorts of aspects of the supply chain, permitting, raw materials, ships to put in place offshore wind turbines, all sorts of things need to happen in order to make that work. And the bottom chart, which comes from BCG, is about past energy transitions. And again, this is to contextualize the fast versus the slow, speeding up or slowing down. We moved quite slowly from our initial dependence on wood into coal and the energy revolution and the industrial revolution. It took us less time, but still a significant amount of time to put oil into the mix. Renewables have taken a small share of the total energy mix and have also taken time. And if you look at the slope of the curve, at the green part at the end, that's how we're trying to address climate change. This is not just about hydrogen. This is about a shift to a net zero energy system in a very short period of time with a very fast learning curve. So we need to think about that in terms of where we are and what we have to do. So are we really slowing down? My thesis is that we're not slowing down at all. What we're doing is we are suddenly aware of the magnitude of what we have to do. So we have been through hype cycles in hydrogen, and we went through one quite recently, which was this enormous enthusiasm around the possibility of developing new industries with very, very low costs of capital and with actually quite a lot of investment potential from within the investment firms who had not found other places to put it, and policy mechanisms which were supportive, and a willingness by governments to try and find new areas to invest. But what we've got to now is what I've characterized by mixing up the views of two different great thinkers. One is Schumpeter, which is about the creative destruction cycle, and the other is Charles Handy, who comes at management theory from a philosophical perspective, but I think it applies very closely to what's happening in energy as well. And so what we've seen historically is we've seen this growth in a particular area. You get solidification, you get return on investment, you get reinvestment, and you get profits. And we're coming to the end of that period for the historical traditional energy economy. And what that means is we're going to create new products and new jobs and new processes, but we're going to destroy the old ones at the same time. And so we have to accept that there will be winners and losers, and we have to find ways to recompense the losers and to enable the winners to continue to invest. And this is part of this doubt and uncertainty phase that we're in. And that's why it feels like we're slowing down. We're looking around saying, oh, I'm not sure this project makes sense anymore. But the point is that if we don't invest, we will stay in this doubt and uncertainty cycle for even longer. So I'm going to finish and allow plenty of time for questions, I hope, with a few thoughts. So we have started well, and we have now got to the realization of how difficult this task is. The whole energy transition is difficult. We are seeing that in areas other than hydrogen as well. We are seeing slowdown in electric vehicle rollout in certain jurisdictions. We are seeing difficulties in putting up offshore wind farms in certain jurisdictions. It's no different from hydrogen. We're going to structure the future around what we learn now. So the decisions we have to make are inevitably under uncertainty. We don't know exactly what the best path will be. We have to be prepared to make some sort of risky investment. And the questions on the left are the ones we need to be thinking about answering. The specific concerns are about how you make a project bankable. My view is that anything that can be simplified should be simplified. So if you can produce hydrogen and use it in an adjacent industry, for example, then we should be doing that first, because that helps us to build supply chains, to get learning, to train people, and to make sure that we have internalized whatever costs are built alongside this learning phase around hydrogen. But we have to move faster, and we can't not choose. As we showed earlier, business as usual is not an option. So we need to move, we need to change, and hydrogen needs to be part of that move. So deciding when and how to do that is essential. And that's the tricky bit. That's the bit where we don't have all of the answers, but at least we can unpick the questions. And I'll be happy to do that with you next. So thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions. A quick reminder again of the World Hydrogen Conference. And if you want, I sometimes post on LinkedIn, not as often as I should, but I have these kind of discussions on there as well. So please do find me and follow me. And now I'll hand back to Arnes to marshal questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hart, for that enlightening presentation. Now we turn to our favorite part of the webinar, the interactive Q&A session. Please type your questions into the chat. I'll bring them forward, ensuring we tackle as many as possible in the time we have left. So let's start with the first question. Is the recent surge in industry interest in hydrogen translating into the real-world progress, or are we witnessing an overblown bubble?
Yes and yes. So I think there is real progress. We are seeing sensible engineering companies and industrial companies investing in supply chain, investing in upskilling their staff, investing in real projects. So there is definite progress. And in 30 years, I've seen things move from what were very often diagrams and PowerPoint slides and concepts and nice ideas to equipment that you can touch and feel and that runs 24 hours a day and rarely, if ever, breaks down. So there's real progress. At the same time, the enthusiasm of the hype cycle that we went through and the enormous amounts of money, for example, that were announced in the IRA mean that a lot of people have entered the market probably without a really solid design or a really good project plan. And so there is definitely froth around the industry, and some of that will just wither away as the economic conditions remain challenging, and we will see the best emerge. So this is a slightly Darwinian phase of evolution.
So we have a next one. Do you agree with the fact that some hydrogen uses are not relevant? Isn't it the duty of the nascent hydrogen industry to fairly focus on what makes sense from a scientific thermodynamic point of view?
So it's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer, strangely. So I'm a mechanical engineer. I like efficiency. I like thermodynamics. But I have come to appreciate over 30 years in the industry that it's not that simple. So in principle, yes, I completely agree. And in fact, you should step back and say, how do we manage demand? How can we improve energy efficiency? How can we make everything better so we need to produce less energy in other ways and transport it around? And then you move to where are the best uses of hydrogen. But the problem is that this is a system question. And so what I was alluding to earlier, which is you might think it's crazy to put hydrogen in a car when in fact a battery will do it perfectly well. And often that will be true. If it so happens that you have very high gas prices or electricity prices, or you have an area which is cut off from renewables, or you have other uses for the hydrogen, or it's produced as an offtake stream from a chemical plant, then in some cases it may make sense to put in hydrogen into areas which, if you just do the bare thermodynamic calculations, don't look as good. So this is about optimizing societal benefit, is how I like to look at it. And that can be economic, can be about job creation, it can be about emissions reduction. It is not always about thermodynamic efficiency. So I think we always need to consider both. We need to consider the thermodynamic efficiency because that's a very important point towards understanding whether something will be economic and whether it will improve the climate situation or not. But in a system context, it may not be the optimum answer. So we can talk about individual cases by all means, but I think the problem is it's very complicated, and we need to look at regions and industries and particular setups case by case.
How does the cost of hydrogen currently compare to traditional energy sources, and how will this impact its future adoption?
It's considerably more expensive in most cases. And that's a really important point because we need to accept that we have to find a different way of working when it comes to energy. So we need to make sure that future energy is affordable and accessible and clean. Those three things are really fundamental. And what we have at the moment is energy that is often affordable, mainly accessible, though there are billions of people worldwide who have no access to electricity and no access to clean fuel for cooking, for example. And the other problem is the sustainability aspect, because mostly energy now is not sustainable, and we pay the cost in other ways. So the costs that we pay now are based on us using the capital that has been developed in the world's banking system, the energy banking system, from fossil fuels that were laid down billions and millions of years ago. So that's and those, we are not living on the interest, we are living on the capital. And we need to find a way of making those fuels affordable, the new ones, be that renewables, be that hydrogen, be that all of the other things that fit into the future energy mix, but not by necessarily making them cheaper. We need to be able to invest enough so that the developers can get a return on investment, so that the governments can get tax because they need tax to keep the world running. And then we recompense the people who cannot afford to pay. So I like the Canadian system, for example, of a climate levy, but it's a climate benefit. So it's not seen as a carbon tax. It's seen as something which is redistribution of wealth. So I appreciate that this is a more of a philosophical approach to economics than it is about energy systems. But I think we need to be upfront that all of the clean energy solutions we are proposing are at the moment more expensive. Renewables have cut through the cost curve in terms of production cost of electricity, but there is still a system that needs to go around them in terms of storage, in terms of intermittency, in terms of delivery, that is complicated and expensive. So we need to move the frame from just X costs more than Y to what is the total system benefit and how do we make sure that everybody involved sees a fair piece of that.
How are current policy developments impacting the adoption of hydrogen across various sectors?
Hydrogen adoption is only driven by policy, except in one or two very, very small cases. So the whole reason for hydrogen to be interesting is because, one, there is policy which drives economic growth. And so there has been policy in Japan, for example, for many, many years, which is about developing hydrogen technologies and developing a hydrogen system, which helps their industry to compete, but also secures supply of something because Japan does not produce much of its own energy, very, very small proportion, in fact, and imports it. So there is a question about that. The other side of it, of course, is climate policy, which is how do we reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and hydrogen comes as part of that. So policies in terms of climate plans, in terms of the the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, in terms of many targets and strategies in Europe, in terms of Australia, are fundamental to driving hydrogen. The difficulty is that these policies are not always coherent, either in a single country or across multiple jurisdictions. And there is complexity behind the policy which people are still working through. And the great example is 45V as part of the IRA. So how many credits do you get for hydrogen depending on how clean it is? And then you have to decide how clean it is. And there are lots and lots of complex calculations about whether it's produced directly from renewables and whether you built a renewable farm specifically in order to produce the hydrogen, and what else would have happened. So policy makes or breaks the investment case for hydrogen in most situations right now. The good news is that gradually we are starting to see policies reinforcing each other, and we start to see things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, which if it had not existed would have meant much less opportunity for hydrogen investment, for example, in clean steel outside of Europe, but is now starting to drive the thinking of industries as to what in future they may have to do, and therefore what investments they may have to make now. So policy is critical, and getting the right policy in place is equally critical, but we have to move probably before all of that policy is finally decided. So that makes it interesting.
Given the current state of hydrogen development, what realistic timeline can we expect for its widespread adoption?
So I think the IEA scenario that I showed sees hydrogen as 4% of total energy use in 2050, if I remember rightly. So in a sense, that's a very small percentage over a very long period of time. However, 4% of total energy use is nevertheless an enormous amount of energy. What I think is that over the next 2 to 3 years, we will settle out of this very messy Darwinian cycle, which is what is causing the pain and confusion around hydrogen. And as we do that, we will see it more and more in certain use cases. We will see some in steel and some in chemicals, and we already have buses and taxis in Europe and in some other places. We'll see these individual use cases which are driven by particular policy strength or particular other things, but it won't be major adoption. And then in the following 5 years, that's when we'll see ramp up. We'll see more and more large-scale projects. We'll have the electrolyzer factories in place. We'll have the ability to put large-scale projects down and guarantee them, make them bankable, have the maintenance contracts set up, have the warranties set up. And that's where we'll start to see it being noticeable. It'll still be a tiny percentage of total energy use, but it'll be a huge industry and it'll be a huge value creator with lots of jobs and billions of dollars associated with the value that it creates. And that's when it becomes meaningful. So let's say 7 to 10 years is the really interesting transition phase where we start to make a meaningful contribution from hydrogen.
What are the biggest roadblocks currently hindering the widespread adoption of hydrogen energy?
So cost is always cited as a roadblock, and I think that's true, but cost is a manifestation of many other things. And I would go back probably to that slide that I showed about the growth of the electrolyzer industry, which is that we're trying to do something several orders of magnitude greater than we've done it in the past, and we're trying to do it very quickly. And that means we simply don't have all of the capabilities in place. So there are policy roadblocks in some places. There are financing roadblocks, which are often linked to policy roadblocks and linked to project capability. But I think a lot of it sits in the system, which is being able to get electrolyzers at a reasonable guaranteed price in a reasonable lead time, getting the right people to build those capabilities and facilities. Simply building a factory takes a year or two. So the roadblocks are in making all of the bits of the supply chain fit together while you're also putting the policy context around them.
And finally, your personal opinion on the hydrogen future.
So, I remain positive. I started doing this 30 years ago when hydrogen was conceptual and philosophically interesting and intellectually challenging, and there were a few tiny demonstrations here or there. And we have already seen an enormous amount of technical progress and real industrial buy-in. We see CEOs of major corporations saying, we have to have hydrogen as part of our future. We are investing. So I am very positive about the future. It's inevitable that there will be some collateral damage along the way. There will be companies that fail. There will be mergers and acquisitions. There will be projects that fail. I hope there are very, very, very few accidents because safety is paramount. All energy carriers bring risk with them. We want to minimize the risk to human life and to ecosystems and to other things. But I don't think we will derail the hydrogen transition now because there are so many investments in place. There are so many developers. There's such an importance to it. So I'm very positive. I'm also very intrigued because I've spent enough time making predictions to know that I'm always wrong, like most people who make predictions. So I don't want to predict speed of uptake. I don't want to predict which exactly the winners are going to be. But I am absolutely confident that we will start to see hydrogen making significant contributions to the economy and a little bit to the energy system in the next 5 years. And from there, it will accelerate. Once we have the building blocks, it will grow.
Thank you, David. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much, Arnes, and thank you for your fantastic hosting.
As we wrap up today's session, I want to thank Professor Hart for his insights and all of you for your engaging questions and participation. We hope you leave today's webinar equipped with a greater understanding and perhaps inspired to engage further in the energy sector's evolution. Keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email with the recording of today's session, additional resources and details on our upcoming webinars. Thank you once again for joining us here at Energy News Biz. We're excited to continue exploring such vital topics with you. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you here again.